The Texas sun seemed to melt everything in its path as Danielle Parker, a black woman with a fierce determination in her eyes, pulled her dusty old pickup truck to the side of a mostly forgotten road just outside Houston. She glanced at the sleek car with fancy California plates, thick smoke curling up from under its hood, and couldn't help but shake her head. Standing a few feet away, in a clearly overpriced suit, was Jeremy Brooks, a man whose entire life revolved around boardrooms and expensive watches. The panic in his eyes was obvious, and he kept checking his phone every few seconds, probably imagining his future slipping away with every minute he spent stranded. Danielle had seen the type before, folks who were comfortable running companies but looked completely lost when real life threw a wrench in their plans. She didn't waste time. "You need a hand," she called out, ignoring the sharp look he gave her at first, like he couldn't believe someone like her would even know what to do. Without waiting for an answer, Danielle dropped to one knee and popped the hood. Her fingers moved with the certainty of years fixing engines, showing him that real skill had nothing to do with business cards or shiny shoes. In a few minutes, she spotted the trouble and got to work, making Jeremy realize that sometimes the real experts aren't the ones with an office view. As Danielle tightened a stubborn bolt beneath the hood, Jeremy lingered nearby, arms folded, watching her every move. He tried to mask his doubts, but it was all over his face. He kept glancing at her, clearly wondering how a woman from some nowhere town could possibly know her way around a car like his. Danielle didn't bother to hide her amusement. Just as Jeremy seemed about to ask something, she looked up and spoke calmly. "I run a shop about 5 miles down that way. Own it too." There was a quiet pride in her voice. No hint of bragging, just facts. "I see all kinds of cars, believe it or not, even the flashy ones." Jeremy was caught a bit off guard. Maybe he expected her to act impressed or intimidated by him, but she just looked him right in the eye and kept working. The minutes ticked by, sweat beading on both their brows, but the awkwardness between them slowly changed. Beneath his impatience, Jeremy started to feel a weird kind of curiosity. He realized Danielle knew exactly who he was. The CEO of Pinebridge Holdings wasn't unknown, not even in these parts. Strangely, though, she treated him like anyone else, and that ease rattled him more than he cared to admit. When Danielle finished getting the engine running well enough to get Jeremy back on the road, she gave the wrench a quick wipe and held out her hand for the payment he'd pulled from his leather wallet. As she reached forward, the sunlight caught on a ring she wore, a delicate old-fashioned band with a blue sapphire that looked like it belonged to another era. The gem flashed just for a moment, but it snagged Jeremy's attention so completely that he almost forgot to hand her the cash. He stared, his eyes wide. The sight of that ring hit him hard, making everything else seem distant and muffled. Memories flooded in, long summer days at his grandmother's house in Austin, a huge oak tree behind the porch, and the voice of someone promising to always be there for him. He remembered a small, careful hand wearing that same kind of blue sapphire, a family ring passed down by his mother. The loss from all those years ago, which he'd tried to bury under work and success, crashed back into his chest. Jeremy's hand shook a little as he struggled to find his words. Barely above a whisper, he asked, "Where did you get that ring?" The question hung heavy between them. Danielle noticed immediately how Jeremy's eyes locked on her ring. Almost without thinking, she curled her fingers into a loose fist covering the sapphire. Her voice shifted from open and friendly to a bit guarded as she answered, "It belonged to my mum. She gave it to me before she passed." There wasn't any room for questions, and Danielle clearly wanted to draw a line right there. She glanced at her watch, then nodded toward the main road, pointing out the way to her auto shop in case the patch-up didn't hold. "If your car acts up again, you'll find Parker's garage about 5 miles east. Folks around here know it. Just ask for Danielle." Jeremy hovered for a second, collecting his suit jacket from the driver's seat. He still needed to get to That meeting in downtown Houston, his mind darting from the merger presentation to the strange, knotted feeling the sight of that ring left in his chest. For a brief, silent moment, he considered asking Danielle more, but something in her steady expression stopped him. He forced a stiff thanks, climbed into his car, and started the engine. As he drove away, dust from the shoulder spinning in the rearview mirror, he couldn't shake the sense that he had left behind something far more important than a business opportunity. Back at Parker's garage, Danielle let her frustration out the only way she knew how, by attacking a stubborn old engine with a socket wrench. Oil smudged her knuckles and her jaw stayed tight. Across the workshop, her Uncle Willie leaned against a worn tool chest, arms crossed, half watching her work and half waiting for her to spill what was on her mind. Uncle Willie had a knack for knowing when something weighed on her, and today her mood was hard to miss. He cleared his throat, not bothering with small talk. "Y'all must have had quite the morning out there. That wasn't just any stranded suit, was it?" Willie's gaze held both concern and quiet encouragement. Danielle finally set the wrench down, letting out a sigh. "Uncle Willie, you remember Jeremy Brooks, the kid from Austin I used to talk about? That was him." She paused, wiping her hands on a rag, her eyes drifting to the open bay doors. 20 years ago, he promised he'd come back for me. I waited for months. When he never showed, Mama told me to move on. And now, today, he didn't even recognize me. Not a hint. Just saw some stranger who happened to have a ring that should have meant something to him." Her words sounded flat, but her uncle read the old hurt behind them. Later that night, after the rest of the house quieted down, Danielle sat cross-legged on her worn bedspread, a small wooden box opened beside her. One by one, she took out fragments of her past. Old letters never sent, faded photos from summers gone, newspaper clippings about Jeremy's quick rise in the corporate world, even the ones showing him engaged to Clarissa Finley, the famous heiress from New York. The headlines made it seem like Jeremy had it all: money, power, a soon-to-be wife from a family every Texan knew. Danielle let her finger trace the edge of one article, thinking how strange life worked out sometimes. She shook her head and muttered, "He's probably already forgotten about today. Probably never gave that ring or me a second thought." But down in Houston, Jeremy was having trouble focusing on anything else. The memory of that sapphire kept popping back into his mind, along with a nagging feeling that he was missing something big. The work emails, even Clarissa's text messages, faded into the background as that old ache grew stronger. Just after midnight, Jeremy made up his mind. He changed out of his expensive clothes, grabbed the keys to his dad's Ford, and pointed it towards the workshop, deciding this time he would show up as himself. No suits, no pretense, just a man not ready to run from his past. When Jeremy pulled up outside Parker's garage early that morning, the air was still heavy and quiet. Danielle was already there, setting out tools for the day, her movements stiff when she noticed who had arrived. She didn't wave or call out, just looked at him with guarded eyes and put an extra couple of feet between them as he stepped from his old truck. Jeremy didn't try to explain himself right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a tiny wooden bird, its paint faded but the shape still whole. He held it out without a word. Danielle recognized it instantly, the simple brooch she had carved years ago and slipped into his hand that last afternoon under the oak. She'd almost managed to bury that memory, along with all the others, but seeing it there brought everything back in a rush. Danielle swallowed hard, her jaw tense. "You said you'd come back. You never did. Not even a letter." "I waited," she said, unable to keep the emotion from her voice. Jeremy looked at her, guilt deep in his face. "I did try, Danielle. I wanted to, but my father, Robert Brooks, wouldn't have it. He made sure I couldn't come back here, not even for a day." The confession hung between them, heavy with old pain neither of them had let go. Willie stepped into the garage just then, wiping his hands on a rag and watching the two of them with sharp, guarded eyes. He had always been quick to pick up when something was off, and right now, the tension in the air was thick. Setting his jaw, he sized Jeremy up, letting the silence settle before finally speaking. "You got business here, or are you just fixing old mistakes?" Willie's tone was careful, but there was no missing the edge. Jeremy took a steady breath and turned to Willie, his voice steady but soft. "I owe you both an explanation. I know I failed her. Both of you, really. My father kept me away, but that's not an excuse. I should have found a way, and I'm sorry. All I'm asking for now is a chance to set it right, or at least to explain." He looked from Willie to Danielle, hoping for some kind of signal that she was willing to listen. Danielle narrowed her eyes, her voice tired but honest. "Why bother now, Jeremy? It's been 20 years. You show up right when your life falls apart." Jeremy hesitated, then admitted, "They want me to marry Clarissa so I can take over the family company, and to be honest, I hate all of it. But seeing you again and that ring made me remember what I actually cared about." What Jeremy kept to himself was that late last night, after tossing and turning in his Houston hotel room, he started digging into Danielle's past. Something about her, the ring, and the old stories she used to tell made him uneasy. So he got on his laptop and tracked down property records and local news archives. What he found surprised him more than he'd expected. There were gaps in the paper trail regarding Danielle's family land, which had once stretched across both sides of the highway. Some older records were missing. The only pieces left had the faded stamp of a company that sounded vaguely familiar, Lone Star Development. He remembered that name from the fine print on his father's legal documents, back when they first started construction on the massive Brooks Industrial Park. Danielle had secrets of her own, though. Tucked in an old coffee tin hidden behind the shelves was a bundle of brittle, yellowed papers, deeds, receipts, and old letters, all signed by Robert Brooks. These showed clear as day that her family's land hadn't changed hands legally. The papers told how Robert had pushed her parents out through backroom deals and forged signatures. The place Jeremy was set to inherit, the Brooks legacy, stood right on land stolen from Danielle's family. But in that crowded garage, the whole truth sat quietly between them, neither quite brave enough yet to let it out into the open. 3 days went by and Jeremy hardly slept. He stashed himself away in the old library of his father's estate, surrounded by stacks of dust-covered binders and boxes marked with faded labels. The deeper he dug, the more doubts he had about what he thought he knew. Official records all pointed to everything being above board, but so many details just did not add up. The more he searched, the more a certain word kept popping up. Copper Ridge, the small Texas town where Danielle grew up, buried at the bottom of a metal filing cabinet, he finally found a thick folder locked tight and labeled Project Copper Ridge. Heart-pounding, Jeremy managed to pry the lock open. Inside, he found contracts, stacks of legal complaints, and right near the top, a document he could hardly believe, an old death certificate for Danielle's mother. But his stomach dropped when he noticed the odd dates and signatures all pointing to forgery. It looked like someone had faked her death years before she'd actually passed. Also, Robert Brooks and Lone Star Development could take over the family property without pushback. Jeremy's hands shook as he stared at the proof. The truth was uglier than he could have ever imagined, and the weight of what his father had done hit him all at once. Meanwhile, over in Copper Ridge, Danielle finally decided she could not hide from the truth anymore. The secrets tucked away in that old coffee tin had weighed on her for too long, and now that Jeremy had come back into her life, everything felt raw and urgent again. That evening, she called Willie into the small back room of the garage, away from the steady noise of the tools and the smell of motor oil. Without hesitating, Danielle laid out the yellowed papers on the table and told him everything. How her family never received fair notice, how the signatures never matched, even showing the fake death certificate she had found shoved in with the rest. Willie's face paled as he took it all in. "You're talking about going straight at the Brooks family?" he asked, his voice a mixture of worry and pride. "They have more lawyers than most folks have cousins." Danielle nodded, gripping the edge of the table. "I don't care, Willie. This can't stay buried anymore. Not for me and not for Mama or all the others they trampled." She glanced down at the sapphire ring on her finger. Now, more than ever, it felt like a sign she was doing the right thing. Justice was overdue, and Danielle knew deep down that she owed it to everyone who had ever called this land home. That night, Jeremy's phone buzzed with a new message from Danielle. She wanted to meet him at the central square in Copper Ridge, a quiet spot with a big pecan tree in the middle, just like the one they'd played under as kids. He arrived first and waited in the deep shade, listening to the shifting breeze and distant crickets. When Danielle walked up, she looked more determined than he'd ever seen her before. They sat together on the edge of the old fountain, the silence heavy but not awkward. After a while, Danielle started talking, her voice soft but steady. "For the longest time, I thought my mother just left us. My dad would never talk about it, and no one else dared to question anything. It wrecked me for years, you know. Then, out of nowhere, I started noticing things that didn't add up. When I found the papers, everything made sense. It wasn't just a cruel twist of fate. Somebody planned it. Your father, Lone Star Development, maybe others too." Jeremy nodded, pulling a fat envelope from his backpack. He laid out the contracts, legal letters, and the forged certificate he'd found. "You're right, Danielle. It was all a sham, start to finish." Looking at those documents there together, they understood that the story was even bigger and dirtier than they'd both feared. Danielle reached into her purse and pulled out a wrinkled photograph. It showed her mother, younger and smiling, standing in front of what used to be miles of green fields, land that now sat under the steel and glass shine of the Brooks corporate headquarters. On her mother's finger was the same sapphire ring Danielle wore now. Danielle's hand shook a little as she handed Jeremy the photo. "Look at this," she whispered. "That ring's been in my family since before I was born. This place wasn't always just another business park. It was home." She drew in a deep breath. "Tomorrow, at the grand opening, I'm telling everyone exactly what they did. No more silence, no more secrets. I'll go up there and let the whole town, and every reporter, politician, and investor hear what your father did to my family, and probably others too." Her voice didn't crack, and her eyes stayed steady, but Jeremy could feel a chill run through him all the same. He stared at the faces in the photograph, thinking about the crowd that would be at the ribbon cutting. Press, big city bankers, state senators. There'd be no chance to contain it. The Brooks name, once untouchable, would finally face everything it had been trying to hide for almost 30 years. Before they parted under the old pecan tree, Danielle confessed there was more she needed to share. Lowering her voice, she told Jeremy about a letter she had gotten years before. No return address, but the writing unmistakably her mother's. The words were shaky, but the message was clear. Her mother was alive and somewhere out there. All Danielle knew was the name scrawled at the top, Hope Springs Clinic, and a city she had never visited. For years, she held on to the hope while everyone else insisted her mother was gone. Jeremy listened closely, then surprised her by saying, "Let's not wait until the opening. We can go tonight." As they climbed into his pickup, Jeremy shared a plan he'd been working on. He talked about how he could use his family's security clearances and stage access at the ceremony in case Danielle wanted to go public and force a confrontation with Robert Brooks in front of the entire crowd. But as the highway stretched, Out before them, with only the hum of the tires and the glow of passing storefronts, Jeremy kept one last thing to himself. He'd already found out exactly where Danielle's mother was. It was not Hope Springs Clinic anymore, but a small, isolated guest house on Rock Creek Ranch, deep in Brooks family territory, kept hidden for leverage. By the time the sun came up, the whole town was buzzing about the grand opening. Limousines and shiny black trucks lined the streets near the new Brooks Plaza, a huge complex that seemed to rise right out of the old fields Danielle had shown Jeremy in that faded photograph. Everything sparkled, from the silver balloons at the gate to the polished marble floors inside. Reporters held microphones out, men in expensive suits exchanged stiff handshakes, and the mayor of Copper Ridge made his rounds with practiced smiles. At the center of it all stood Robert Brooks, confident as ever, flashing his famous grin for the press. But the second he spotted Danielle and Jeremy weaving through the crowd together, his whole expression changed. A cold edge came over his face, enough to make folks nearby shift uneasily and look away. Robert wasted no time. Motioning to his security team, he called Jeremy and Danielle upstairs to his private office. Once the thick door swung shut behind them, Robert skipped the pleasantries and got straight to business. He leaned forward, quietly offering Danielle a check, more money than she had ever seen in her life, if she agreed to disappear, just like her mother had. Danielle said no right away, pushing the check back across the desk. "I don't want your money," she said firmly. "Tell me where my mother is. I'm not leaving here without the truth." Robert let out a cold laugh, acting like Danielle's pain was just another inconvenience. He leaned back in his chair, tossing the check aside. "You people never learn," he said. But in his arrogance, he slipped up, dropping little hints about how some folks were better off out of sight, just like Danielle's mother. Jeremy, who had started a recording on his phone the moment they stepped into the office, caught every word. His heart pounded when he realized Robert was practically admitting that Danielle's mother had been hidden away. Not lost or dead, but kept somewhere for all those years. Before Robert could say more, the door opened. Willie stepped in, his face serious. Beside him was an elderly woman, thin and frail, but with eyes just like Danielle's. For a second, nobody moved. Then Danielle whispered, "Mama," and crossed the room as if nothing else mattered. The reunion was quiet, neither needing to say much. Danielle and her mother held on to each other, tears streaming down their faces, surrounded by the sons and daughters of the very people who had caused them so much pain. Jeremy watched in silence as the truth landed in the room, heavy and undeniable, and finally understood the full cost of the secrets the Brooks family had been hiding. The sudden appearance of Susan, Danielle's mother, threw Robert completely off balance. His cool mask cracked as he realized there was no way out. The office felt too small, full of truths that would not stay hidden anymore. Everyone could see he was cornered, with Jeremy holding up the phone that had caught every guilty word, and Willie, who had finally chosen a side, standing beside Susan like a silent witness. Danielle would not let go of her mother, even as the room waited for Robert's next move. Jeremy, his voice shaky with anger, turned to face the man he'd thought he understood. "Why?" he asked, struggling to keep calm. "Why would you do this? To take someone's family, to take their land just for money?" Robert looked at everyone, his pride showing even as he started to talk. He tried to justify everything, saying the land they stole was sitting on the largest freshwater reserve in all of Texas, worth billions, maybe more. His voice got louder, angrier. Then, almost like an afterthought meant to wound, he dropped one last secret. "You were never my blood," he told Jeremy. "I adopted you when I lost my real son. You were meant to fill that hole. Nothing more." The weight of those words settled over everyone, changing things in a way that felt final. Jeremy felt like the ground gave out beneath him. The word adopted echoed in his head, and it made everything he thought he knew about his place in the Brooks family feel false. He glanced at Danielle, wondering if anything between them was real anymore. Across the room, Janice, who had quietly followed events from the corner, stepped forward and dropped a thick file on the desk. She said she couldn't keep quiet any longer. Inside were records showing Robert Brooks had arranged several questionable adoptions over the years, fabricating birth certificates, lying to authorities, and making sure every secret stayed buried. This wasn't just about land or money now. People's whole identities had been torn apart for his own gain. Willie, always calmer than the rest, moved closer to Jeremy, putting a hand on his shoulder. "There's more to this than you know," he said quietly. Janice started reading from the documents, her voice shaking only a little. The evidence pointed straight to an even bigger twist. Danielle and Jeremy shared the same biological mother, Susan. They were brother and sister, separated when they were young and manipulated by Robert's web of forged paperwork and false stories. In an instant, the old lines between enemies and family were suddenly gone, replaced by shock and a strange dawning realization that none of their lives would ever be the same. The realization hit Jeremy and Danielle like a punch to the gut. For years, they had seen hints in each other, a tilt of the head, the same way they half smiled when nervous, but neither could have guessed they were family. Now, as their eyes met across the crowded office, it was suddenly so clear. Jeremy unconsciously reached up and touched the old silver ring that had hung around his neck for as long as he could remember. A ring with a carved pattern that matched the one Danielle wore on her finger. Seeing their confusion, Susan took a shaky breath and started to explain. She said she had slipped the ring onto Jeremy before they were torn apart, hoping he would someday use it as a sign to find her. It was the only thing she could give, a small thread of hope in a world where nothing was certain. Danielle listened, eyes brimming with tears, finally understanding why the ring had always felt special. In that moment, the mystery of their past became something honest and whole. As the last words left Susan's lips, the sharp sound of police sirens sliced through the thick air outside. The Brooks family's long grip on Copper Ridge was finally broken, and the years of secrets and lies were coming to an end. In the days that followed, Houston's news outlets couldn't get enough of the story. Every headline carried Robert Brooks' name, along with words like fraud, kidnapping, and forgery. The secrets he had spent his life hiding were front-page news. Photos of his arrest played over and over on TV, and people all over Texas spoke in shock about the things he had done and how he had been able to keep the truth hidden for so many years. The Brooks empire collapsed almost overnight. Company signs taken down, office doors locked, and the land that had started all the trouble was finally returned to Susan and her children. The biggest surprise came when the land wasn't sold off or left empty, but turned into something better, a community center and a nature reserve where families could gather and kids could play safely. Danielle and Jeremy took the lead, and months later, you could find them working side by side in the old workshop, now fixed up and painted bright yellow. They spent their days fixing bikes, teaching local kids, and running the new Heart of Houston Foundation, set up to help children who had lost their own families. That ring stayed close, sometimes around Danielle's neck, sometimes in Jeremy's pocket, a simple reminder that truth, in the end, had brought everyone home.